You are 12 years old, standing in the center of the Constantinople Hippodrome. 80,000 people surround you. The roar is so loud you cannot hear your own breathing. You are not here to watch. You are here to perform. Your sister stands beside you, trembling. Your mother waits in the shadows behind the stone archway, counting coins that will never be enough. You wear nothing but a thin costume designed to reveal, not to cover. The crowd already knows what kind of performance is coming. They paid extra for it. And when the lights focus on you, when the chanting begins, when strange men start shouting instructions from the front rows, you understand something your mother never told you. This is not entertainment. This is survival disguised as spectacle. And tonight, like every night, you will do what you are told. Because refusal means starvation. Because protection does not exist. Because in the Byzantine Empire of the year 512 CE, children like you are not considered victims. You are considered merchandise. And the empire profits from every moment of your humiliation. This is not legend. This is not exaggeration. This is the documented early life of Theodora, who would later become one of the most powerful empresses in Byzantine history. But before the crown, before the throne, before the laws she would write to protect women, there was this. A childhood spent performing in the Hippodrome. A body used for entertainment before it was old enough to consent. A girl trapped in a system that transformed exploitation into public revenue. And what makes her story even more disturbing is that Byzantine society did not hide this. They celebrated it. They institutionalized it. They built an entire economic structure around it. And when Theodora finally escaped, when she clawed her way to power and tried to dismantle the system that had destroyed her, the same historians who praised the empire tried to erase her past, to rewrite her story, to make sure future generations never ask the uncomfortable question. If the greatest empress of Byzantium survived this, how many others did not? If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe to Grim History, hit the like button, and once you reach the moment that unsettles you most, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. To understand how Theodora ended up in the Hippodrome at age 12, we have to go back 3 years earlier, to the moment her father died. His name was Acacius. He worked as a bear keeper for the Green Faction, one of the two great circus organizations that dominated Constantinople's entertainment industry. These factions were not simply sports teams. They were political machines, economic powerhouses, and social hierarchies that controlled everything from chariot racing to public opinion. When Acacius died suddenly, Theodora's mother, left with 3 young daughters and no income, did what thousands of desperate women in Byzantium did. She remarried quickly, hoping the new husband would inherit Acacius's position and salary. But the Green Faction refused. They gave the job to someone else. A younger man. A man with connections. And Theodora's family was left with nothing. No income, no protection, no options. Except one. The Hippodrome was not just an arena. It was an industry. Chariot races drew crowds of 100,000. But between races, there were performances. Acrobatics, comedy acts, animal displays, and something the Byzantines called pantomimes. These were theatrical performances that often included suggestive dancing, partial nudity, and increasingly explicit displays as the night progressed and alcohol flowed. Children were preferred for certain acts, not because they were more talented, but because their presence added shock value. Because audiences paid more. Because Byzantine law did not protect performers under 14, they existed in a legal gray zone where exploitation was not technically illegal, simply normalized. The Hippodrome itself stretched nearly 450 meters, with marble seating rising in tiers. The imperial box sat elevated, draped in purple silk. From there, emperors and their guests watched everything. Theodora's mother brought her 3 daughters to the Blue Faction, the Green's rival organization, and offered them as performers. Theodora was 9. Her sister Camito was 12. Their youngest sister, Anastasia, was 6. The Blues accepted, not out of charity, but because child performers were profitable. And this is where Theodora's life as a public spectacle began. She started with small roles, carrying props, standing in background formations, learning choreography designed to entertain men 3 times her age. The training was rigorous. Hours each day rehearsing movements, perfecting timing, learning to smile even when exhausted. Performers who failed to please were replaced. There was always another desperate family waiting. Always another child willing to do what the last one refused, but as Theodora grew older, the roles changed. By age 12, she was no longer background. She was the attraction. And what came next would mark her for the rest of her life, the performances Theodora participated in were described by Procopius, a Byzantine historian who despised her, in his Secret History, a text so scandalous it remained hidden for centuries that he writes with obvious bias, exaggerating for effect, attempting to destroy her reputation. But even accounting for exaggeration, the core details remain disturbing. Theodora performed in acts that involved removing clothing on stage. She participated in tableaux vivants, living sculptures where performers posed in mythological scenes, often nude or nearly nude, while audience members watched and commented. She danced, she stripped, she performed, and according to Procopius, by age 15, she had transitioned from performer to something else entirely. A companion available for hire after shows. A body offered to wealthy patrons who wanted private access. These arrangements were brokered by managers who took percentages. The girl received a fraction, just enough to survive, never enough to leave. Was she forced? Legally, no. Byzantine law recognized performers as independent contractors. But independence is an illusion when the alternative is starvation, when there is no other skill, when society offers no other path. Theodora did not choose this life, she survived it, not because she wanted to perform, but because performing meant eating. And the Hippodrome made sure she understood the rules. Performers were taxed. Their income was tracked. A portion went to the faction. A portion went to managers. What remained was barely enough to eat. Escape was impossible because debt accumulated faster than earnings. Housing was provided but deducted from wages. Food was available but charged at inflated prices. This was not slavery in name. It was slavery in function. A system designed to trap women and children in cycles of exploitation while generating profit for the state, and Theodora was not unique. Thousands of girls moved through this system. Most disappeared into obscurity. Some died young, their bodies worn out before age 25. Others transitioned into brothels, another state-regulated industry where exploitation continued under legal protection. The Byzantine Empire tracked these women with the same administrative precision it used to track grain shipments. Tax records survive. Names, ages, earnings. Girls as young as 10 listed alongside livestock and imported goods. Human beings reduced to line items in imperial accounting. And no one questioned it. Not the church, which profited from entertainment taxes. Not the aristocracy, which attended performances. Not the emperor, who granted licenses. The system functioned smoothly because everyone benefited. Everyone except the girls trapped inside. But Theodora had something most did not. Intelligence. Ambition. A refusal to accept this as her permanent condition. By age 16, she began planning escape. She studied the men who hired her, learning what they valued, how they thought, what weaknesses they revealed in private moments. She saved every coin she could hide, wrapping them in cloth and burying them beneath loose floorboards. And when a wealthy official named Hippodrome offered to take her to North Africa as his mistress, she accepted, not because she loved him, but because North Africa meant distance from the Hippodrome. A chance to start over. A possibility of something different, and for a while, it worked. She lived in relative comfort in Pentapolis. She was fed, clothed, protected. Hippodrome held a minor administrative position. Theodora's role was decorative, expected to appear at dinners and entertain guests. It was not freedom, but it was better than the Hippodrome. Until Hippodrome grew bored and abandoned her in Alexandria, leaving her alone in a foreign city with no money and no connections. He simply left one morning. No explanation, no severance. She woke to find him gone. Then came the moment that would change everything. Most women in that situation would have returned to the only life they knew. The ship captains traveling back to Constantinople knew the Hippodrome. They offered passage in exchange for services. It would have been easy to slip back into that role, to accept that escape had failed. But Theodora did something different. She stayed in Alexandria and began studying philosophy and theology with a group of Monophysite Christians who operated a small community near the docks. Why? Because education was the one thing that could not be taken away. Because learning transformed her from an object into a person. Because she understood that knowledge was the only tool she had left. She worked during the day, spinning wool for textile merchants. At night, she attended discussions, asked questions, memorized theological arguments. She learned to read Greek fluently. She studied the works of Cyril of Alexandria. She debated the nature of Christ with monks who initially dismissed her, then grew to respect her precision. She spent 2 years in Alexandria, reading, debating, learning to speak with authority, and when she finally returned to Constantinople around 522 CE, she was different. No longer a performer, no longer desperate, composed, educated, controlled. She found work spinning wool near the palace district where aristocratic households purchased supplies. She did not advertise her past. She simply worked, attended church, and waited. And that is when she met Justinian. What happened next shocked the entire empire. Justinian was not yet emperor. He was heir to the throne, nephew of the current emperor Justin. And according to multiple sources, when he met Theodora, he became obsessed. Not just with her beauty, but with her intellect. Her ability to speak on theology, law, and politics with precision. Her refusal to perform submission. She was unlike any aristocratic woman he had known. Those women had been trained since childhood to manage households and remain silent during political discussions. Theodora argued. She questioned. She offered solutions. And Justinian, who had spent years surrounded by sycophants, found this intoxicating. He wanted to marry her. But there was a problem. Byzantine law forbade senators and imperial heirs from marrying actresses and performers. The legal code explicitly listed theatrical women as unfit for noble marriage, not because of their character, but because their bodies had been commodified. Theodora's past disqualified her. So Justinian did something extraordinary. He convinced his uncle, Emperor Justin, to change the law. In 525 CE, a new legal decree was issued, allowing men of senatorial rank to marry former actresses if they had reformed their lives. The law was written specifically for Theodora. It acknowledged that women could be forced into performance through poverty and should not be permanently condemned. And in 525 CE, Theodora became Justinian's wife. The aristocracy was horrified, not because of morality, but because a hippodrome performer had outranked them. Senators whispered. Aristocratic women refused to acknowledge her at court. But Justinian did not care. And when Emperor Justin died in 527 CE, Theodora became empress of the Byzantine Empire. And almost immediately, she began using imperial authority to dismantle the system that had destroyed her childhood. She passed laws protecting women and children in entertainment. She outlawed forced prostitution. She established shelters for women escaping exploitation. She gave legal rights to performers, granting them the ability to leave contracts without penalty. She created a convent called the Metanoia, the House of Repentance, where former sex workers could live with imperial protection, free from debt and threat. She personally funded the convent from imperial revenues. She hired administrators. She ensured women received education, medical care, and vocational training. Over 500 women lived there during her reign. None were forced to leave. She prosecuted brothel owners who violated regulations. She gave women the legal right to own property independently of husbands. She reformed marriage laws, making it harder for men to divorce wives or confiscate dowries. She established legal recourse for women subjected to violence. And she did all of this while governing the empire alongside Justinian, advising on military campaigns, theological disputes, and legal reforms. She attended council meetings. She received foreign ambassadors. She negotiated treaties. When the Nika riots erupted in 532 CE, threatening to overthrow Justinian, Theodora refused to flee. According to Procopius, she stood before the panicking council and declared that purple, the color of imperial authority, made an excellent burial shroud. She would rather die as empress than live as a refugee. Her resolve convinced Justinian to stay. The empire survived because Theodora refused to run. But here is where the story becomes darker. And what comes next reveals the true cost of her survival, because while Theodora wielded unprecedented power, the same society that had exploited her never forgave her for surviving. Aristocratic historians, especially Procopius, spent decades writing attacks designed to destroy her legacy. The secret history is filled with lurid, exaggerated tales of sexual excess. He describes acts so graphic they were censored for centuries. He claims she turned palace chambers into brothels. He accuses her of murdering rivals. He presents her as a demon in human form. Why? Because a former performer had become more powerful than men who considered themselves her superiors. Because she had escaped the category they created for her. Because survival itself was a form of defiance, not because she was immoral, but because her existence challenged every assumption they held. So they wrote her story as scandal. They focused on her body instead of her laws. They ensured that future generations would remember the Hippodrome, not the reforms. They turned her survival into pornography and erased the system that made survival necessary. And it worked. For over 1,000 years, Theodora was remembered primarily through Procopius's attacks. Historians repeated his claims without question. Theodora the prostitute. Theodora the shameless. Theodora the Corrupt. It was not until the 20th century that scholars began reading past the misogyny, examining the legal reforms, recognizing the pattern. Theodora did not just escape exploitation, she used imperial power to attack it systematically. She understood the structures because she had lived inside them. Yet even now, most popular retellings still focus on her sexual past, still frame her story as scandal rather than survival. And this matters because Theodora was not an exception. She was the one who survived long enough to gain power. But how many others died in the Hippodrome? How many girls performed until their bodies gave out, then disappeared into unmarked graves? The Byzantine Empire kept meticulous records of grain and military supplies. But the names of child performers were written in ink that faded. Their stories were never preserved. Their suffering was considered entertainment. Their pain was considered profit. Their deaths were considered routine. And the system that consumed them continued for centuries after Theodora's death, outlasting her reforms, re-emerging in new forms. Theodora died in 548 CE, likely from cancer. She was around 48 years old. Justinian was devastated. He never remarried. And for years after her death, he continued implementing laws she had championed. But without her presence, enforcement weakened. Protections eroded. The Hippodrome continued staging performances. The cycle resumed. Because one woman, no matter how powerful, could not dismantle centuries of institutional exploitation. Systems survive individuals. Theodora understood this. That is why her laws focused on structure, not morality. She did not try to shame men into decency. She removed legal protections for exploitation. And for a brief moment, it worked. But moments do not outlast empires. What remains today are fragments. Theodora's legal decrees, preserved in Justinian's code. Mosaics in Ravenna, showing her crowned, regal, powerful. Procopius's vicious attacks, still quoted as history. And the ruins of the Hippodrome, now a tourist site in Istanbul. Do they know what happened here? Do they know that children performed in this space while emperors watched? Do they know that one of those children became an empress and tried to burn the system down? Probably not. Because that story is uncomfortable. Because acknowledging it means recognizing that exploitation was not an accident. It was policy, not by criminals, but by senators. And when Theodora tried to end it, she was called a whore. Not because of what she did, because of what was done to her. There is a question historians avoid asking. Why did Theodora keep fighting? She had escaped. She had married the most powerful man in the empire. She could have distanced herself from her past, lived in luxury, pretended it never happened. But she did not. She built convents for women who reminded aristocrats of what they wanted to forget. She wrote laws that forced senators to confront the system they profited from. She stood in councils and debated theology with men who believed she had no right to speak. She fought anyway. Why? Because she remembered the Hippodrome. Because she remembered being 12. Because she knew that girls were still standing in that arena, with no one coming to save them. And perhaps that is the most disturbing part of Theodora's story. Not what happened to her, but what did not happen afterward. Because even after her reforms, even after her laws, even after an empress stood up and said this is wrong, the empire continued. Different forms, same function. The Hippodrome was eventually abandoned, but exploitation found new venues. Theodora proved that survival was possible. But she also proved that survival was not enough. Systems do not change because one person escapes. They change when society decides the cost is too high. And Byzantine society never made that decision. So when we admire the mosaics, when we study Byzantine architecture, when we celebrate Justinian's legal code, remember the 12-year-old girl standing in the Hippodrome. Remember that the empire we praise was built partially on her suffering. Remember that she survived not because Byzantium protected her, but despite every structure designed to destroy her. Theodora did not save every girl in the Hippodrome. She could not save every girl. She tried anyway. And for that, they called her shameless. Perhaps the real shame belongs to the empire that made her survival necessary. If this story moved you, ask yourself how many modern systems operate on the same logic. How many structures profit from desperation and call it opportunity? How many people survive exploitation and are then blamed for the survival strategies they used? Theodora's story is not ancient. It is a template, a warning, a mirror held up to every society that claims progress while protecting the systems that consume its most vulnerable. And if you have followed this account to the end, write Theodora in the comments. So we know you saw her, not as scandal, not as empress, but as the 12-year-old girl who survived when the empire wanted her erased.